I never thought I'd attend my own funeral, but there I sat in the back row of St. Matthew's Chapel, watching my children tear each other apart over money they thought was theirs. The whole charade started 3 months earlier, when my doctor delivered news that would change everything. Stage 4 cancer, he said, maybe 6 months if I was lucky. But what he didn't know was that I'd been planning something far more dramatic than just dying quietly. The idea came to me during one of those sleepless nights when the pain medication wore off. My kids hadn't visited in months, but suddenly they were calling every day asking about my affairs and whether I needed help getting things in order. Their concern felt hollow, like actors reading lines they didn't believe. That's when I decided to give them the performance of a lifetime. Sarah, my eldest at 42, had always been the calculating one. Even as a child, she'd figure out exactly what chores would earn her the most allowance with the least effort. Now she was a successful real estate agent, married to a surgeon, living in a mansion across town. Yet somehow, she was the most interested in my financial situation. Her calls always started with, "How are you feeling, Dad?" but quickly shifted to questions about insurance policies and property deeds. Marcus, my middle child at 39, ran his own construction company. He'd built a good life for himself, but apparently not good enough. His interest wasn't in my health either. He kept offering to help by having the house appraised, just to know its value for planning purposes. He'd drive by sometimes, not to visit but to take photos of the exterior for insurance documentation, he claimed. David, my youngest at 35, seemed different. He actually asked about my pain levels and offered to drive me to appointments. But even he had started hinting about making things easier for everyone when the time came. He spoke about liquidating assets and avoiding probate complications. The word liquidating coming from my baby boy's mouth felt like a knife to the chest. Working with my lawyer Jonathan Mills and my oldest friend Pete Morrison, we crafted an elaborate scheme that would reveal my children's true nature once and for all. Jonathan had been handling my legal affairs for 20 years and was disgusted by what he'd witnessed during recent family meetings. Pete had been my neighbor and hunting buddy for over 3 decades. He'd watched my kids grow up and was equally appalled by their recent behavior. We staged my death perfectly. The hospital was in on it thanks to Dr. Martinez, who'd been treating my wife Elena during her final years and understood the importance of family loyalty. The funeral director, Jim Reeves, owed Pete a favor from way back and agreed to provide an empty casket and keep our secret. Even the local newspaper ran my obituary, complete with a photo from my retirement party 5 years earlier. The morning of my funeral, I felt a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. I'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, but seeing it unfold was surreal. I wore a baseball cap pulled low and dark sunglasses, clothes I'd never worn around town. My gray beard was trimmed shorter than usual, and I sat hunched forward to disguise my height. To anyone glancing back, I looked like just another elderly mourner paying respects to someone they barely knew. As people filed in, I recognized faces from 40 years of life in this town. My old co-workers from the steel mill, neighbors from 3 different houses I'd lived in, members of the volunteer fire department where I'd served for 15 years. These people had genuine sadness in their eyes. They whispered stories about my kindness, my work ethic, my devotion to Elena during her illness. But my children, they sat in the front row like they were attending a board meeting. Sarah kept checking her phone, probably coordinating with her husband about their vacation plans that were apparently more pressing than mourning their father. Marcus wore an expensive watch and kept glancing at it like he was timing the service. David looked sad, but I caught him nodding along when Sarah leaned over to whisper something about handling the estate efficiently. The pastor was delivering a beautiful eulogy about my life of service and devotion to family, reading from notes I'd provided weeks earlier through Pete. He spoke about my 38 years at the mill, my volunteer work, the way Elena and I had raised 3 children on modest means but rich love. Every word was true, but my children weren't listening. They were too busy planning their windfall. That's when Sarah pulled out a folder at their father's funeral service. She quietly showed Marcus some papers, pointing to numbers and whispering calculations. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught enough. Property values, liquidation timelines, tax implications. They were dividing up my life's work while my supposed corpse lay 20 feet away. The final straw came when I saw Marcus actually smile while looking at whatever Sarah was showing him. He covered it quickly, glancing around to make sure no one noticed, but I saw it. My middle son was smiling at his father's funeral because he was calculating his inheritance. That's when I knew this wasn't going to be just a funeral. It was going to be a reckoning that would expose their greed in ways they never imagined possible. The moment that truly broke my heart came during the reception at Morrison's Hall. I sat at a corner table, unrecognized by anyone except Pete, who occasionally glanced my way with barely contained anger at what we were witnessing. The room buzzed with condolences and shared memories, but my children had claimed a private table in the back corner, huddled over Sarah's laptop like business partners closing a deal rather than mourners honoring their father. I watched as neighbors and friends approached them with heartfelt stories about the man they thought was gone forever. Mrs. Peterson from next door, 83 years old and walking with a cane, made her way over to Sarah with tears in her eyes. She wanted to tell my eldest daughter about how I'd shoveled her driveway every winter for 15 years, never asking for anything in return, always refusing her offers to pay for the service. "Your father was such a blessing to me," Mrs. Peterson said, her voice shaking with genuine emotion. "After my Harold passed, Robert became like a guardian angel. Every storm, every heavy snow, I'd wake up to find my driveway clear, and my car scraped off. When I tried to thank him, he'd just wave and say that's what neighbors do." Sarah barely looked up from her screen where she was browsing real estate listings for comparable homes in the neighborhood. "That's nice, Mrs. Peterson. Dad was always helping people." The dismissal was so cold, so mechanical, that Mrs. Peterson actually stepped back. The confusion and hurt on her face was visible from across the room. She'd come to share a beautiful memory and received the emotional equivalent of a form letter response. But it got worse. As Mrs. Peterson walked away, clearly wounded by the interaction, I heard Sarah mutter to Marcus, "We need to be careful about all these people coming around with sob stories. They'll probably start asking for handouts, claiming Dad promised them things." Marcus nodded, not even bothering to look up from his own phone where he was apparently researching construction companies for the house renovation. "Already thought of that. We should probably get the locks changed on the house this week, before word gets out that it's sitting empty." The house wasn't even cold yet, metaphorically speaking, and they were already planning to lock out the community that had loved and supported me for decades. These were people who'd shared holiday meals with our family, who'd helped us through Elena's illness, who'd celebrated my children's graduations and weddings. Now they were being treated like potential threats to the estate. The real gut punch came when I overheard Marcus on the phone with someone, probably his wife Jennifer. He was standing near the coffee station, speaking in hushed tones but not quietly enough to avoid my trained ears. 38 years in a noisy steel mill had taught me to pick out conversations in crowded spaces. "The house alone should bring in at least $400,000, maybe $450 if we put some money into the kitchen," he was saying, his back turned to the room full of mourners. "Sarah thinks we can get the workshop cleared out by next weekend. All that old machinery and tools. We can probably sell to his buddies at the mill." "Yeah, I know it seems fast, but why drag this out? It's not like Dad's coming back to complain about the timeline." He actually chuckled. My middle son, standing at his father's funeral reception, laughed while discussing the liquidation of everything I'd built with my own hands. The workshop where I'd taught him to use a lathe, where we'd built his first bicycle together, where I'd crafted the rocking horse that his own children had played on just last Christmas. To him, it was just inventory to be moved quickly. David seemed uncomfortable with his siblings' behavior, but he didn't speak up. He sat quietly picking at the sandwich the church ladies had prepared, occasionally nodding when Sarah or Marcus addressed him directly. His silence felt like complicity, and that hurt almost as much as his siblings' active greed. The most devastating moment came when I heard Sarah on her phone with someone, probably her husband Richard. She'd stepped outside onto the hall's small porch, but the window next to my table was open just enough for me to catch most of the conversation. "Honestly, Rich, it's almost a relief," she said, her voice carrying a lightness that seemed obscene given the circumstances. "Dad had been getting so difficult lately, always guilt-tripping us about not visiting enough, always complaining that we didn't call. Now we can move forward without walking on eggshells every time we make plans that don't include him." She paused, listening to her husband's response, then continued. "I mean, I feel bad saying it, but he was becoming a burden. Always needing rides to appointments, wanting us to come over for dinner every Sunday like we were still teenagers living at home. This way we get closure and we can help him one last time by making sure his assets don't just sit there gathering dust." The word burden. She'd called me a burden. The man who'd worked overtime for 20 years to pay for her college education, who'd walked her down the aisle at her wedding, who'd babysat her children every weekend for the first 5 years of their lives so she and Richard could have date nights. I was a burden. That's when I realized this wasn't just about money. They hadn't just excluded me from their adult lives in recent months. They'd systematically rewritten our entire relationship to justify their neglect and make my death convenient rather than tragic. Sitting there watching my children calculate their inheritance, my mind drifted back to the sacrifices Elena and I had made to give them everything they needed. The irony was crushing. These same hands they now saw as a burden had worked themselves raw to build the very wealth they were so eager to claim. I remembered 1987 when Sarah was 16 and desperate to attend the state science competition. The entry fee, travel costs, and hotel would have wiped out our vacation savings, but Elena and I didn't hesitate. I picked up weekend shifts at the mill for 3 months straight, working 7 days a week until my back screamed and my hands cracked from the cold steel. Sarah won second place and got a scholarship to State University. When she called to tell us, she was crying with joy. "Dad, I couldn't have done this without you and Mom believing in me." That same year, Marcus broke his leg during football season and needed surgery. Our insurance covered the basics, but the specialist who could ensure he'd walk without a limp wasn't in our network. Elena took on a second job cleaning offices at night while I started doing weekend construction work with my buddy Pete. For 4 months we barely saw each other except to pass in the hallway between shifts. Marcus healed perfectly and went on to play college football on a full scholarship. He hugged me so tight after his first college game, saying, "Dad, you made my dreams possible." David's turn came in the 90s when he showed incredible talent for music. Piano lessons, violin lessons, youth orchestra fees, competition costs. We sold Elena's engagement ring to buy him a decent violin when he made regional orchestra. I'll never forget the look on her face when she handed over that ring, the symbol of our young love, without a single complaint. "Music is his gift," she said simply. "We have to nurture it." David cried when he found out what we'd done, promising to pay us back someday. He never did, but back then it didn't matter. The college years nearly broke us financially, but we made it work. Sarah at State University studying business, Marcus at the community college before transferring to finish his construction management degree, David at the music conservatory 3 states away, 3 kids, 3 different schools, 3 sets of expenses we could barely afford on a mill worker's salary. I remember the winter of 1994 when our furnace died right before Christmas. The repair estimate was $1,800 we didn't have. Elena and I wore coats inside the house for 2 weeks while I worked double overtime shifts to earn the repair money. We told the kids the furnace was being upgraded and turned it into an adventure, having indoor camping nights in the living room with blankets and hot chocolate. They thought it was fun. They never knew their parents were choosing between heat and their spring tuition payments. Elena's illness changed everything. The cancer diagnosis came when David was finishing his senior year, and Marcus was planning his wedding. The medical bills started piling up immediately. Experimental treatments, specialist consultations, medications that insurance wouldn't cover. I took out a second mortgage on the house without telling the kids because I didn't want them to worry about money when their mother was fighting for her life. I worked every available overtime shift for 3 years during Elena's treatment. 16-hour days became normal. I'd come home exhausted, help Elena with her medications, then sit by her bed reading to her until she fell asleep. Weekends meant driving her to appointments in the city, sometimes staying in cheap motels when the treatments ran late. I used up all my vacation days and sick leave, then took unpaid time off when she needed me most. The kids were busy with their own lives then. Sarah had just started her real estate career and was working 70-hour weeks trying to establish herself. Marcus was building his construction business and had 2 young children. David had moved to Nashville chasing his music dreams. They visited when they could, called regularly, sent flowers and cards. But the daily grind of caregiving fell to me, and I gladly carried that weight. When Elena died, I was left with a mountain of debt and an empty house full of memories. The kids helped with funeral arrangements, stayed for a week afterward, then returned to their lives. I understood. They had careers, families, responsibilities. I didn't expect them to put their lives on hold for their grieving father. What I didn't expect was how completely they would drift away afterward. Sunday dinners became monthly phone calls. Monthly calls became holiday check-ins. Holiday visits became rushed stops between other obligations. When I tried to reconnect, suggesting family barbecues or offering to babysit grandchildren, I was met with polite excuses and busy schedules. The final blow came last year when I had a minor heart attack. I called Sarah first, thinking my eldest would want to know immediately. Her response was to ask if I'd called 911 and suggest I contact David since he lived closer. No offer to come to the hospital, no genuine concern in her voice, just efficient problem-solving from a distance. That night, lying alone in my hospital bed, I realized I'd become an inconvenience to the very people I'd sacrificed everything to nurture and support. The children who'd once clung to my legs begging for stories now saw me as an obligation to be managed rather than a father to be cherished. Watching them now, dividing up my life's work like corporate raiders, I wondered if they even remembered those sacrifices or if they'd convinced themselves that everything they'd achieved was solely through their own efforts. The most painful part of watching my own funeral reception wasn't seeing my children's greed. It was listening to how they'd rewritten our family history to make themselves the victims and me the villain. As I sat in that corner booth nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, I heard them spinning a version of our relationship that bore no resemblance to reality. It started when Sarah's husband Richard arrived late, still wearing his golf clothes and clearly annoyed at having his Saturday interrupted. Sarah immediately pulled him aside and began what sounded like a rehearsed explanation of why they shouldn't feel guilty about their father's death or their excitement about the inheritance. "You know how demanding he became after Mom died," Sarah told Richard, her voice carrying that tone people use when they want to sound reasonable while saying unreasonable things. "Every Sunday he expected us for dinner, even when we had other plans. He'd guilt-trip us if we missed a week, going on about how lonely he was and how family should stick together. It was emotional manipulation, honestly." I nearly choked on my coffee. Sunday dinners that I'd suggested maybe once a month, which they'd attended perhaps 6 times in 3 years. And I'd never once made them feel guilty for missing. If anything, I'd been overly understanding when they canceled, always saying we could reschedule when it was more convenient for them. Marcus joined the conversation, nodding along like Sarah was reciting established facts. "Remember when he had that heart attack last year? Instead of just going to the hospital like a normal person, he called Sarah first, trying to make her feel responsible for his health problems. Classic guilt manipulation." My mouth fell open. I'd called Sarah because I was scared and alone, and she was my eldest child. When you think you might be dying, you want to hear your daughter's voice. But in their version, my moment of vulnerability had become calculated emotional blackmail. "And don't get me started on the money issues," Sarah continued, warming to her theme. "He was always hinting about his financial struggles, mentioning the medical bills from Mom's treatment like we were supposed to offer to help. But every time we suggested he downsize or move somewhere more affordable, he'd get stubborn and refuse to consider it." This was perhaps the most twisted revision of all. I'd mentioned Elena's medical bills exactly once, and only when Sarah had asked directly about why I'd refinanced the house. I'd never asked any of them for financial help, never even hinted that I expected it. As for downsizing, they'd never suggested it. What they'd suggested was that I sell the house and move into a senior living facility because it would be easier for everyone to manage. David, who'd been mostly quiet until now, added his own contribution to the false narrative. He started getting really clingy after his retirement, calling multiple times a week, dropping by our houses unannounced, always wanting to help with projects we could handle ourselves. It felt suffocating. Clingy. That's what they called a father who missed his children and wanted to be part of their lives. My weekly phone calls, which usually lasted less than 10 minutes and consisted mainly of asking about their jobs and children, had become harassment in their minds. My offers to help with yard work or home repairs, skills I'd developed over 40 years of homeownership, were now invasive intrusions rather than loving gestures. Richard, who'd been listening with the detached interest of someone hearing office gossip, finally spoke up. "Sounds like he never really adjusted to being alone. Some people get bitter when they age, start expecting the world to revolve around them." Bitter. They thought I was bitter. The man who'd celebrated every promotion, every achievement, every milestone in their lives with genuine pride and joy. The father who'd never missed a graduation, wedding, or grandchild's birthday party until they'd stopped inviting me. In their narrative, my sadness at being excluded had transformed into bitterness and entitlement. The final piece of their revisionist history came when Marcus's wife Jennifer arrived with their 2 children. She hugged Sarah and immediately launched into her own version of events. "I'm so glad this is finally over," Jennifer said in a stage whisper that carried across the room. "Marcus has been stressed for months trying to manage his father's neediness while running his business. Robert just couldn't accept that his children had their own lives to live. My neediness. Asking to see my grandchildren more than twice a year was neediness. Wanting to share holiday meals with my family was selfish. Hoping that 40 years of being a devoted father might earn me a place in their adult lives was unreasonable." As I listened to them cement this false narrative, I realized they weren't just rewriting history for Richard and Jennifer's benefit. They were convincing themselves that I'd been the problem all along. This wasn't casual conversation. This was a coordinated effort to construct a version of our relationship that justified their neglect and made their excitement about my death morally acceptable. In their story, they weren't heartless children abandoning their aging father. They were long-suffering victims finally freed from a manipulative, clingy, bitter old man who'd made their lives difficult through his unreasonable expectations and emotional demands. After hearing my children rewrite 20 years of family history to justify their greed, I knew it was time to retreat and plan my next move carefully. I slipped out of Morrison's hall during a lull in the reception, when most people were focused on the dessert table and my children were huddled around Sarah's laptop finalizing their liquidation timeline. Pete caught my eye as I headed toward the back exit and gave an almost imperceptible nod. Phase 1 was complete. Now the real work would begin. The drive back to Pete's cabin felt surreal. For the past 4 hours I'd been officially dead, watching my life dissected by the very people I'd sacrificed everything to support. The silence in Pete's old pickup truck was heavy with unspoken anger. Neither of us trusted ourselves to speak until we were safely away from town, where no one could accidentally overhear the dead man talking. 43 years I've known you, Bob, Pete finally said, as we pulled into his driveway, hidden by a grove of pine trees 3 miles outside town. I've watched you raise those kids, sacrifice for them, love them unconditionally. What I saw today makes me ashamed to be human. I nodded but didn't respond immediately. I was too busy processing everything I'd witnessed and heard. My children hadn't just disappointed me. They'd revealed themselves to be fundamentally different people than I'd believed them to be for decades. The question now was what to do with that knowledge. Pete's cabin became my command center for the next phase of the operation. I'd officially died on a Tuesday. The funeral was Friday. By Saturday evening, I was sitting at Pete's kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, mapping out exactly what my children planned to do with my estate and what I was going to do to stop them. The first priority was intelligence gathering. I needed to know their exact timeline, their financial motivations, and how far they were willing to go. Pete, who'd been my hunting buddy for decades and knew everyone in town, became my eyes and ears. His wife Margaret had passed 5 years earlier, so he lived alone and could move around freely without raising suspicions about his activities. Sunday morning brought the first crucial intelligence. Pete drove past my house and called me with his report. "There's a locksmith van in your driveway, Bob. Sarah's car is there too. Looks like they're making good on Marcus's plan to change the locks." The speed of their actions was breathtaking. I'd been dead less than 72 hours, and they were already securing the property like they were afraid someone might challenge their claim. The house I'd lived in for 35 years, where I'd raised them and cared for their dying mother, was being sealed off from the community that had supported our family for decades. Monday brought even more disturbing news. Pete's neighbor worked at First National Bank, where I'd done my banking for 20 years. Through careful conversation at the coffee shop, Pete learned that Sarah had attempted to access my accounts as executor, only to discover that the will they thought existed was actually quite different from what they'd expected. This was where Jonathan Mills, my lawyer, had earned his fee. The will my children had seen during our family meeting 3 months earlier was real but incomplete. It was what lawyers call a preliminary draft, designed to give them enough information to feel confident about their inheritance while hiding the true details of my final wishes. The real will, the one that would be read officially, contained several surprises that would shake their world. Tuesday brought intelligence about their plans for my workshop. Pete learned from his coffee shop sources that Marcus had contacted 3 different equipment dealers about selling my tools. 40 years of accumulated machinery, including the lathe my own father had given me, and the workbench I'd built with my hands when Sarah was still in diapers. To Marcus, it was just used equipment to be converted to cash as quickly as possible. But the most revealing intelligence came Wednesday, when Pete overheard Sarah at the grocery store talking to her friend Linda about vacation plans. She was booking a cruise for next month with the money from my life insurance policy, celebrating her newfound financial freedom. She actually used those words, describing her father's death as financial freedom. As I sat in Pete's cabin each evening, reviewing the day's intelligence and planning my response, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose. For the first time since Elena's death, I had a mission that required all my skills and determination. My children thought they were dealing with a dead man's simple estate. They had no idea they were about to face the strategic planning abilities of someone who'd spent 4 decades solving complex problems under pressure. The silence I maintained during those first days after my funeral wasn't just about staying hidden. It was about gathering strength, collecting information, and preparing for a confrontation that would expose their greed and selfishness in ways they'd never anticipated. They thought the game was over. In reality, it was just beginning. The first week after my funeral taught me that being dead had unexpected advantages when it came to gathering evidence against my own children. People say things around dead men that they'd never say to their faces, and my children were providing me with more ammunition than I could have hoped for. Pete had become my intelligence network, but I needed more than secondhand reports. I needed documented proof of their actions and attitudes. That's when I remembered the security system I'd installed 2 years earlier after a series of break-ins in the neighborhood. The cameras were motion-activated and stored footage in a cloud server that my children didn't even know existed. Even better, they'd changed the locks but hadn't thought to disconnect the system. Working from Pete's laptop, I accessed the security footage from the day after my funeral. What I saw made my blood boil. Sarah and Marcus weren't just changing locks. They were conducting a full inventory of my possessions like professional estate sale organizers. Sarah had brought a clipboard and was methodically cataloging items room by room, taking photos and making notes about potential values. The most damning footage came from my workshop. Marcus had brought 2 strangers with him, clearly equipment appraisers based on how they examined my tools and machinery. I watched my middle son sell my father's lathe for $800, A tool worth at least $3,000, but apparently not worth the effort of getting a proper appraisal. The workbench where I'd taught all 3 children basic carpentry skills was dismissed as old furniture and marked for donation. But it was the audio that truly broke my heart. The security system had picked up their conversation as they worked through my bedroom, the room where their mother had spent her final months. "We should probably keep some of Mom's jewelry for sentimental value," David suggested, holding up Elena's wedding ring, the replacement I'd bought her after we sold the original for his violin. Sarah barely glanced up from her inventory sheet. "Sentimental value doesn't pay bills, David. That ring is worth maybe $2,000. We'll get it appraised with the rest." Even Elena's memory had a price tag in their minds. The woman who'd sacrificed her own engagement ring for David's music career was being reduced to assessed value by the very son she'd made that sacrifice for. Meanwhile, Pete was gathering intelligence from other sources. His Tuesday coffee group at Murphy's Diner had become an unwitting surveillance network. Martha Henderson, who worked at the real estate office where Sarah was employed, mentioned that Sarah had already contacted 3 agents about listing my house, despite the fact that probate wouldn't be finalized for weeks. "She's telling everyone it's a sure thing," Martha reported to Pete, not knowing he was relaying every word to me. "Already talking about staging it for a quick sale and splitting the proceeds 3 ways. Says her father was getting too old to maintain the property anyway." The most valuable intelligence came from an unexpected source. Jennifer, Marcus's wife, had apparently been keeping detailed records of their financial planning around my estate. She'd left her purse open during a visit to the house, and Pete's sharp eyes caught sight of a notebook when he stopped by to check on the property as my supposed neighbor friend. Working with Jonathan Mills, we discovered that Jennifer had been pressuring Marcus to claim his inheritance quickly because they were facing financial problems with the construction business. 3 major contracts had fallen through, and they were behind on equipment payments. My death wasn't just convenient timing, it was financial salvation for their failing business. The breakthrough came when I accessed my phone records through the online account portal. My children had no idea I kept detailed digital records of everything. The phone logs revealed a pattern of communication between them that started months before my cancer diagnosis. They'd been discussing my situation and planning for my eventual death long before I became seriously ill. Most damning was a series of text messages I retrieved from Sarah's phone through a family tracking app I'd forgotten was still active. She'd been texting her husband regularly about my health decline, not with concern but with anticipation. "Dad looked really weak at dinner Sunday. Doctor says these things progress quickly at his age." Read one message from 2 months before my staged death. Her husband had replied, "Good timing with David's wedding coming up. Insurance money would cover most of the costs." They'd been planning my funeral reception while I was still cooking them Sunday dinners. The final piece of evidence came from the most painful source of all. David, the son I'd thought was different from his siblings, had left a voicemail on his wife's phone that the security system had recorded when he called from inside my house. "The music room is full of instruments that Dad probably spent 30 grand on over the years." David's voice came through clearly on the recording. "Most of it's too old to be valuable, but there's enough here to pay off our credit cards and maybe take that vacation to Europe we've been talking about." The son whose musical talent I'd nurtured through sacrifice and love was liquidating the very instruments that had shaped his abilities, treating them like commodities rather than the tools of his artistic development. By the end of that first week, I had hours of video footage, phone records, financial documents, and witness statements that painted a complete picture of my children's character. They weren't just greedy, they were calculatingly mercenary, treating their father's death as a business opportunity rather than a family tragedy. The ally I never expected came in the form of my youngest son's wife, Rebecca. I'd always liked her, but we'd never been particularly close. She was quiet during family gatherings, seemingly content to let David handle the family interactions while she focused on their 2 young children. What I discovered during my second week of being dead completely changed my understanding of who Rebecca really was and what she'd been observing all these years. The revelation came through Pete, who'd been maintaining his cover as the concerned neighbor checking on my empty house. Rebecca had shown up Tuesday morning with a small bouquet of flowers and a folded piece of paper. She'd asked Pete to place the flowers by my front door and give him the note, saying it was something private she wanted to share about Mr. Hayes. When Pete handed me that note back at the cabin, I wasn't prepared for what I read. "Mr. Morrison," the note began, "I know you and Robert were close friends, and I hope you'll understand why I'm writing this. I can't say this to anyone else in the family, but Robert's death has shown me things about my husband and his siblings that make me ashamed to be part of this family. What they're doing to his memory and his property isn't grief. It's greed, plain and simple." She went on to describe exactly what I'd been witnessing through my security footage. David had come home from the house inventory sessions excited about the value of various items, treating his father's possessions like prizes he'd won rather than memories to be cherished. Rebecca had listened in growing horror as her husband calculated the worth of instruments his father had bought him, tools that had taught him carpentry, and books that had shaped his education. The worst part, the note continued, is how they've convinced themselves that Robert was somehow a burden who had it coming. David actually said last night that his father had been manipulative for wanting to spend time with his grandchildren. I've watched Robert with our kids, Mr. Morrison. He lights up around them. He's the most devoted grandfather I've ever seen. But David sees those requests for visits as emotional blackmail. Rebecca's note revealed that she'd been keeping her own records of the family's behavior, not for financial gain but out of a sense of justice. She'd photographed text messages, recorded conversations, and documented instances where the siblings had lied to their father about why they couldn't visit or call. The most powerful part of her message was personal. I need you to know that Robert Hayes was a wonderful father and grandfather who deserved so much better than what his children gave him. If there's any way to honor his memory properly, please let me know. This isn't how good men should be remembered. I realized I needed to meet with Rebecca directly, despite the risks. Through Pete, we arranged a clandestine meeting at the old lumber mill outside town, a place where we wouldn't be spotted by anyone who knew the Hayes family. I wore a disguise that had been working well. Different clothes, a baseball cap, sunglasses, and a fake mustache that made me look like a different person entirely. Rebecca's shock when I revealed myself was profound, but it quickly turned to relief and then anger on my behalf. I can't believe they drove you to this, she said, tears in her eyes, but I'm glad you get to see who they really are. She'd brought a folder with her, evidence she'd been collecting for weeks before my staged death. Phone screenshots showing David complaining to his siblings about having to visit his needy father. Photos of conversations where Sarah calculated the inheritance value while their father was still alive. Even recordings of Marcus discussing renovation plans for my house before I'd even been declared terminally ill. I started documenting this stuff months ago, Rebecca explained. I could see they were treating you like an inconvenience instead of their father. I kept thinking someone needed to witness the truth, even if I couldn't do anything about it at the time. But Rebecca brought more than evidence. She brought a plan. As someone inside the family circle, she could feed them information, document their reactions, and even influence their decisions in subtle ways. She could be my eyes and ears in places where Pete couldn't go and my voice of reason when they started to suspect something wasn't right. Most importantly, Rebecca confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. My grandchildren had been asking about their grandfather constantly since the funeral. They missed our weekend visits, our workshop projects, our fishing trips. David had been telling them that Grandpa was too sick to see them in his final months, but Rebecca knew the truth. I'd been healthy and eager for their company right up until my staged death. They love you, Mr. Hayes, Rebecca said firmly. Whatever you're planning to do to teach their parents a lesson, remember that those kids need their grandfather. They're the real victims in all this. That's when I knew Rebecca wasn't just an ally in my quest for justice. She was my moral compass, the person who would help me navigate revenge without losing sight of what really mattered. Family relationships that were worth saving and innocent grandchildren who deserved better than parents who valued money over love. With Rebecca's help, my plan evolved from simple revenge to something more sophisticated. A reckoning that would expose my children's greed while protecting the grandchildren who still believed their grandfather had been a good man worth missing. 2 weeks after my own funeral, I decided it was time for Robert Hayes to rise from the dead. Not literally, of course, but dramatically enough to shatter my children's world and expose their greed to everyone who mattered. The plan I developed with Pete, Jonathan, and Rebecca was both simple and devastating. I would return from the grave during the official reading of my will. Jonathan had scheduled the will reading for Thursday afternoon at his law office on Main Street. My children arrived separately but with obvious coordination, each bringing their spouses and folders of documents they'd prepared for what they assumed would be a straightforward distribution of assets. Through the security cameras Jonathan had agreed to install for this moment, I watched them settle into their chairs with the confidence of people who believed they'd already won the lottery. Sarah sat at the head of the conference table like she was chairing a board meeting, her laptop open to what appeared to be a spreadsheet dividing my assets 3 ways. Marcus kept checking his phone, probably coordinating with contractors about renovating my house for a quick sale. David seemed more subdued than his siblings, but he'd brought his own folder of documents and kept glancing at his watch like he had somewhere more important to be. The first shock came when Jonathan announced that there would be a special guest joining them for the reading. Your father left specific instructions that someone important to his estate planning should be present for this meeting, he said, walking toward his office door. I think you'll find this person's testimony quite illuminating. That's when I walked in. The silence in that room was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Sarah's mouth literally fell open, her pen dropping onto her legal pad with a small clatter that seemed to echo in the sudden stillness. Marcus shot up from his chair so quickly he knocked it backward, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something approaching terror. David just stared, his folders slipping from his hands and scattering papers across the polished conference table. "Hello, children," I said calmly, taking the seat at the opposite end of the table from Sarah. "I trust you've been managing things well in my absence." The explosion of voices that followed was exactly what I'd expected. Sarah was demanding explanations, Marcus was asking if this was some kind of joke, and David was repeating "this isn't possible" like a broken record. Their spouses sat frozen, probably trying to process the legal and social implications of what they were witnessing. I let them rage and question for a full minute before raising my hand for silence. The authority in that gesture, practiced over decades of managing factory workers and raising children, cut through their panic immediately. "I'm going to explain exactly what happened and why," I said, my voice steady and calm. "But first I want you to understand that everything you've said and done in the past 2 weeks has been recorded, documented, and witnessed. Your true feelings about your father, your plans for his estate, and your complete lack of grief or respect have all been captured for posterity." Jonathan placed a tablet on the conference table and pressed play. The security footage from my house began rolling, showing them cataloging my possessions, discussing values, and dismissing sentimental items as worthless. Then came the audio recordings of their conversations at the funeral reception, their false narratives about my character, and their excitement about their inheritance. Sarah found her voice first, but it was shaky and defensive. "Dad, this is insane. We thought you were dead. We were just trying to handle your affairs responsibly." "Responsibly?" I replied, pausing the video on a frame showing Marcus selling my father's lathe for a fraction of its worth. "Is this what you call responsible? Liquidating family heirlooms without proper appraisals? Changing locks on my house before my body was even cold? Planning vacations with my life insurance money?" Marcus tried a different approach, his construction worker's practicality kicking in. "Look, Dad, we can explain all this. We thought we were doing what needed to be done. You can't blame us for planning ahead." "Planning ahead," I repeated slowly. "Is that what you call discussing my death as financial freedom while standing next to my coffin? Is that what you call erasing 20 years of sacrifice and devotion to make yourselves feel better about abandoning your father?" That's when David, my youngest, the one I'd hoped might be different, finally spoke up. "Dad, I know this looks bad, but we were grieving in our own way. Everyone handles death differently." I looked directly into his eyes. This son I'd given up so much for, whose musical education had cost me Elena's engagement ring and years of second jobs. "Grieving, David? Rebecca showed me the text messages where you calculated the value of the instruments I bought you. The same violin we sold your mother's ring to purchase. Tell me, son, how exactly does that constitute grief?" The mention of Rebecca caused David's face to go white. He realized that his own wife had been working against him, documenting his betrayal of the father who'd sacrificed everything for his musical dreams. The silence that followed was different from the shocked stillness of my entrance. This was the silence of people who had been completely and utterly exposed, their masks stripped away to reveal the shallow, greedy individuals they'd become. They sat there like defendants waiting for a verdict, finally understanding that their father wasn't just alive. He was armed with evidence, support, and a plan that would change everything they thought they knew about their inheritance and their future. The aftermath of my revelation was like watching a controlled demolition. My children's carefully constructed world of entitlement and justified greed collapsed in stages, each realization hitting them with increasing force as they began to understand the scope of what I'd orchestrated and witnessed. Sarah was the first to attempt damage control, her real estate agent training kicking in as she tried to negotiate her way out of the impossible situation. "Dad, okay, this is clearly some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe we moved too quickly, but we were trying to honor your memory and handle things efficiently. You taught us to be practical, right?" I opened the folder Jonathan had prepared and pulled out printed screenshots of her text messages. "Is this what you call honoring my memory, Sarah?" I read directly from her phone. "Finally don't have to pretend to care about Dad's boring stories about the old days. Richard, book that cruise for next month. We're celebrating our financial freedom." Her face went from defensive to mortified as I continued reading her messages aloud. The clinical detachment with which she discussed my death, the excitement about liquidating my assets, the relief at no longer having to maintain a relationship with her father. Each message was a nail in the coffin of any excuse she might have offered. Marcus tried a different strategy, falling back on anger to mask his shame. "This is entrapment or something. You can't just fake your own death and then use it against us. There have to be laws against this kind of manipulation." "Manipulation?" I set down another stack of documents. "Like manipulating your children into believing their grandfather was too sick to see them when he was perfectly healthy? Like manipulating equipment dealers into undervaluing family heirlooms so you could pocket quick cash? Like manipulating your wife into thinking your father's death was a financial blessing. Jonathan spoke for the first time since my entrance. Actually, Marcus, everything your father did was completely legal. Staging one's own death isn't a crime when no insurance fraud is involved and no one is actually harmed. However, some of your actions regarding the estate might have legal implications we should discuss. That's when the real panic set in. David's wife Jennifer started whispering urgently to Marcus about the equipment they'd already sold, the contracts they'd signed, and the money they'd spent based on anticipated inheritance. Sarah's husband Richard was frantically typing on his phone, probably canceling their cruise reservations and trying to calculate their financial exposure. But it was David's reaction that cut me the deepest. Instead of anger or defensive justification, he simply put his head in his hands and started crying. Not tears of relief that his father was alive, but tears of shame and self-recognition. He'd heard his own words played back to him, seen his own calculations exposed, and finally understood what he'd become. "I don't know who I am anymore," David said through his tears. "I heard myself on that recording talking about selling your instruments like they were just objects. These are the same instruments that gave me everything I have in life. What kind of person does that make me?" For a moment I felt my resolve waver. This was my baby boy, the son I'd sacrificed Elena's ring for, the child whose musical talent had filled our house with joy for years. But then I remembered Rebecca's folder, the evidence of months of callous planning and calculated neglect. Sarah found her voice again, but now it carried a note of desperation. "Dad, what do you want from us? An apology? Fine, I'm sorry. We all are. But you can't expect us to have handled this perfectly. Losing a parent is traumatic and people make mistakes when they're grieving." "Grieving," I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "Sarah, you booked a vacation to celebrate my death. Marcus, you sold family heirlooms before my funeral flowers had wilted. David, you planned to liquidate the instruments that represented your mother's sacrifice. None of you grieved, you celebrated." The silence that followed was broken by Jennifer, Marcus's wife, who had been growing increasingly agitated as the implications sank in. "This is insane. We have contracts based on that inheritance money. We've made financial commitments. You can't just change everything because your feelings were hurt." That statement crystallized everything wrong with my children's perspective. They saw this as a financial inconvenience rather than a moral reckoning. My staged death hadn't just exposed their greed, it had revealed their complete inability to understand the emotional and ethical dimensions of their betrayal. "Your feelings were hurt," I repeated Jennifer's words slowly. "Is that what you think this is about? Hurt feelings?" I stood up and walked to the window overlooking Main Street, where I could see people going about their daily lives, unaware that the dead man they'd mourned was standing 20 feet away. "This isn't about hurt feelings," I said, turning back to face them. "This is about character. This is about discovering that the children I raised, the people I sacrificed everything for, became strangers who saw their father's death as a business opportunity. This is about learning that everything I believed about my family was an illusion." The shock on their faces was complete now. They finally understood that this wasn't a prank or a test they could pass with the right apology. This was a fundamental reckoning with who they'd become and what they'd lost in the process. Word travels fast in a small town, especially when that word involves a man rising from the dead to expose his children's greed. By Friday morning, less than 24 hours after my dramatic revelation at the law office, the entire community knew that Robert Hayes was very much alive and that his children had shown their true colors in spectacular fashion. The story spread through Murphy's Diner, the post office, the hardware store, and every other gathering place where neighbors shared news and gossip. But this wasn't just idle chatter about family drama. This was a community grappling with the disturbing reality that they'd watched 3 grown children celebrate their father's death while he sat among them in disguise. Pete had become an unwitting celebrity as the friend who'd helped orchestrate the most talked-about scheme in the town's history. At Murphy's Diner, he found himself surrounded by people wanting to know every detail of how we'd pulled it off and what we'd discovered about my children's behavior. "I've known Bob Hayes for 43 years, Pete told the breakfast crowd, his voice carrying the authority of a longtime resident. "I watched him raise those kids, sacrifice for them, love them unconditionally. What I witnessed at that funeral reception was the most shameful display of greed I've ever seen from people who should have been mourning their father." The community's reaction was swift and decisive. Martha Henderson, who'd worked with Sarah at the real estate office, started sharing stories about how Sarah had been planning the house sale before the funeral flowers had even been delivered. Tom Wilson from the bank revealed that Marcus had tried to access his father's accounts within hours of the supposed death. Even the pastor at St. Matthew's Chapel expressed his horror at learning how the grieving children had actually spent the reception. But the most powerful shift came from the people who genuinely mourned my passing. Mrs. Pearson, who'd tried to share her story about my kindness at the reception only to be dismissed by Sarah, was particularly vocal about what she'd witnessed. I went to that funeral with tears in my eyes for a man who'd been like a son to me, she told anyone who would listen. I tried to tell his daughter how much he'd meant to our neighborhood, and she treated me like I was interrupting a business meeting. Now I know why. She wasn't mourning her father. She was counting his money. The domino effect was immediate and devastating for my children's reputations. Sarah's real estate clients started questioning whether they wanted to work with someone who'd treated her own father's death as a financial opportunity. Marcus's construction business began losing contracts as word spread about how he'd liquidated family heirlooms for quick cash. David's music students started canceling lessons, their parents uncomfortable with his character after learning how he'd valued his father's instruments in dollars rather than memories. The most telling shift came from the younger generation in town. Parents started using my children as cautionary tales about greed and family loyalty. "Don't you ever treat your father and me the way the Hayes kids treated poor Robert," became a common warning in households across town. Rebecca played a crucial role in this community shift by sharing the evidence she'd collected with trusted neighbors. She didn't broadcast private family conversations publicly, but she made sure key community leaders understood the depth of callousness she'd witnessed. Her reputation as a devoted daughter-in-law gave her testimony particular weight. "I loved Mr. Hayes like he was my own father," Rebecca told the Church Ladies Auxiliary, her voice breaking with genuine emotion. Watching his own children treat him like a burden, seeing them celebrate his death while their kids cried for their grandfather, it was the most heartbreaking thing I've ever experienced. The shift wasn't just social. Local businesses that had extended credit or special arrangements to my children based on their anticipated inheritance suddenly demanded immediate payment. The equipment dealers who'd bought my tools at below-market prices found themselves under community pressure to make things right. Even the funeral home faced questions about why they'd participated in what some people saw as an elaborate deception, though Jonathan had ensured all legal requirements were met. Perhaps most significantly, the story attracted attention beyond our small town. A regional newspaper picked up the story, and within days journalists were calling Jonathan's office asking for interviews about the man who'd attended his own funeral and discovered his children's true nature. But the real power of the community shift was emotional rather than practical. For decades my children had benefited from being Robert Hayes's kids, the offspring of a respected man who'd contributed to the town's life and character. Overnight that heritage became a liability as people compared their behavior to the father who'd raised them with such different values. The power dynamic that had defined my relationship with my children for the past few years completely reversed in the aftermath of my resurrection. For months they had treated me like an aging inconvenience whose opinions and feelings could be dismissed. Now, suddenly, I held all the cards, and they were scrambling to salvage what they could from the wreckage of their exposed greed. The first sign of the reversal came Monday morning when I returned to my own house for the first time since staging my death. The locks they'd changed so quickly were changed again, this time by a locksmith working on my orders. The security system they'd never known about was upgraded, and Jonathan had ensured that all legal ownership of my property was clearly re-established. Walking through my house felt like touring a crime scene. They'd removed family photos, packed away Elena's belongings, and cleared out decades of accumulated memories in preparation for their quick sale. But what struck me most was how sterile the place had become. This had been a home full of warmth and history. In their hands it had become just another piece of real estate to be processed. The real power shift became apparent when my phone started ringing. Sarah called first, her voice carefully controlled but unmistakably desperate. "Dad, we need to talk. There are some financial complications from the past few weeks that we need to sort out together." Financial complications. That was how she described the equipment they'd sold, the contracts they'd signed, and the money they'd spent based on their assumed inheritance. I listened to her explain their situation with the same detached interest she'd shown while planning my estate liquidation. "I see," I said when she finished outlining their exposure. "So you need my help cleaning up the mess you created while celebrating my death. Is that an accurate summary?" The silence on the other end of the line was telling. Sarah, who'd spent years treating her father like someone whose approval was optional, now needed that same father to protect her from the consequences of her own actions. Marcus called next, his approach more direct but equally desperate. "Dad, look, I know we screwed up, but I've got contractors expecting payment, equipment loans that need covering, and Jennifer is talking about divorce if we lose the house. I need to know where we stand." "Where you stand," I repeated slowly, "is exactly where you put yourselves. You made financial decisions based on money that wasn't yours yet, counting on the death of a father who turned out to be very much alive. Those consequences belong to you. But the most significant power reversal involved my grandchildren," Rebecca had been keeping them informed about their grandfather's situation in age-appropriate ways. When they learned I was alive, their joy was pure and uncomplicated, unlike their parents' mixture of shame and financial panic. 8-year-old Emma, David's daughter, summed up the situation with the clarity only children possess. Daddy said Grandpa was too sick to see us, but Grandpa wasn't sick at all. Daddy was lying. Her 5-year-old brother Jake simply wanted to know when Grandpa could come fishing again. That weekend I picked up my grandchildren for our first reunion since my death. Rebecca had prepared them carefully, explaining that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes and that their grandfather had needed to go away for a while to think about important things. The children's excitement at seeing me alive was everything their parents' reaction had not been. Genuine, loving, and unconcerned with financial implications. At the park where I'd taken them countless times before, Emma asked the question that cut to the heart of everything. "Grandpa, are you going to disappear again?" "No, sweetheart," I told her, lifting her onto the swing I'd pushed thousands of times. "Grandpa is back to stay, and this time, I know exactly who my real family is." The true measure of the power reversal became clear that evening when David showed up at my door. Not to argue or justify or negotiate, but to ask if he could see his children while they were with me. The man who'd once had unlimited access to his father now needed permission to spend time with his own kids in his childhood home. "They missed you," he said quietly, watching Jake show me a drawing he'd made at school. More than I realized, more than I let myself see. For the first time since my revelation, David seemed to understand what had really been lost. Not just money or inheritance, but the relationship with a father who genuinely loved spending time with his family. The power wasn't just reversed, it was redefined around what actually mattered. The bonds between people who truly cared for each other. The begging began in earnest once my children fully grasped the scope of their predicament. What had started as financial complications quickly spiraled into a full-blown crisis that threatened not just their inheritances but their marriages, businesses, and standing in the community. Watching them scramble to undo months of calculated greed was both satisfying and heartbreaking. Sarah was the first to attempt a complete reversal of her position. She arrived at my house on Wednesday evening with a folder full of documents and what appeared to be a prepared speech. She'd clearly spent considerable time crafting her approach, trying to find the right balance between contrition and self-preservation. "Dad, I've been doing a lot of thinking since Thursday," she began, settling into the living room chair where she'd once sat as a child listening to bedtime stories. "I realize now that grief affects people in different ways, and maybe my way of coping was to focus on practical matters instead of dealing with the emotional reality of losing you." Her attempt to reframe her greed as a grief response was almost impressive in its audacity. She'd brought printouts of psychology articles about task-oriented grief and practical coping mechanisms, apparently hoping to convince me that liquidating my assets had been therapeutic rather than mercenary. "I've canceled the cruise," she continued, pulling out travel agency paperwork as evidence of her reformed priorities. "Richard and I both realized that celebrating while the family was in crisis was inappropriate. We want to make this right." But her most desperate gambit was emotional manipulation disguised as family reconciliation. "Dad, I know I can't undo the things I said or did, but I want you to know that losing you taught me how much I actually need my father in my life. These past few weeks without you have been the hardest of my adult life." The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd spent the weeks after my supposed death happier and more excited than I'd seen her in years. Now that her father was inconveniently alive and in control of his assets, suddenly she needed him desperately. Marcus took a different approach when he showed up the following day. Instead of psychological justification, he went straight to practical desperation. He looked haggard, like he hadn't slept in days, and his usually confident demeanor had crumbled into barely controlled panic. "Dad, I'm in serious trouble," he said without preamble. "I made commitments based on the inheritance, and now I'm looking at bankruptcy if we can't work something out. Jennifer's talking about taking the kids and moving back to her mother's. My business reputation is destroyed. I need your help." His honesty was refreshing compared to Sarah's elaborate justifications, but it was still fundamentally selfish. He wasn't apologizing for treating my death as a windfall. He was asking me to bail him out of the consequences of that mindset. "I know I screwed up," Marcus continued, his voice breaking. "I know I treated you like a burden instead of my father. But I'm begging you, don't let my stupidity destroy my kids' lives. They don't deserve to pay for my mistakes." The mention of his children was calculated but not entirely manipulative. Marcus genuinely loved his kids, even if he'd lost sight of how to love his father. Still, using innocent grandchildren as leverage felt like another betrayal wrapped in a plea for mercy. David's approach was the most painful because it was the most genuine. When he came to see me, he didn't bring documents or justifications or desperate pleas for financial salvation. He brought something much more valuable and dangerous: real remorse. "I don't have any excuses," he said, tears already streaming down his face. I turned into someone I don't recognize, someone who could calculate the value of instruments you sacrificed to buy me. I became someone who could lie to his own children about why they couldn't see their grandfather. His breakdown was complete and unguarded. I keep thinking about Mom's ring, Dad, how you and she sold it so I could have that violin. And then I sat in your house after your funeral, figuring out how much money that same violin could bring me. What kind of person does that make me? David's remorse felt authentic, but it was also the most dangerous to my resolve. He wasn't trying to manipulate me or negotiate his way out of consequences. He was genuinely horrified by his own actions and wanted nothing more than the chance to somehow make amends. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, he continued. I know I threw away the relationship with the best father anyone could ask for. But if there's any chance, any way I can earn back even a small part of what I lost, please tell me what to do. The difference between David's plea and his siblings was stark. Sarah and Marcus wanted me to fix their problems. David wanted to fix himself. The time had come to close this chapter of my life with actions that would serve as both judgment and teaching moment for my children. I'd expose their greed, reverse the power dynamic, and listen to their pleas. Now I needed to make decisions that would define our relationships going forward, and provide symbolic closure to the most painful experience of my life. The first symbolic act involved my will, the document that had started this entire ordeal. With Jonathan's help, I drafted a new version that reflected not just my wishes for asset distribution, but my assessment of my children's character based on their actions during my staged death. The reading would take place in the same conference room where I'd risen from the dead, giving the moment additional weight. This time, all 3 children arrived with their spouses, but the atmosphere was completely different. Gone was the confident anticipation of easy wealth. Instead, they sat quietly, almost fearfully, waiting to learn the consequences of their revealed greed. The original will, you were so eager to execute, I began, looking at each of them in turn, has been replaced with one that takes into account everything I learned about your character while I was supposedly dead. For Sarah, whose betrayal had been the most calculating and cold, the symbolic consequence was the most severe. Sarah, you treated my death as a business opportunity, and my love as emotional manipulation. Therefore, your inheritance will be held in trust for your children's education, with you receiving only a modest annual stipend. You'll need to earn their respect the same way I had to earn yours, except they'll have the advantage of seeing both versions of their mother. Her face went white as she realized she'd be financially dependent on children who might one day judge her as harshly as she'd judged her father. Marcus, whose desperation seemed genuine but whose actions had been equally mercenary, received a different kind of justice. Marcus, you sold family heirlooms for quick cash and treated decades of memories as inventory to be liquidated. Your inheritance will be used to buy back every item you sold at below market prices. Whatever remains after correcting your mistakes will be yours, but first you'll help me restore what you destroyed. The symbolism was clear. He'd have to personally undo the damage he'd caused before benefiting from my estate. But it was David's judgment that required the most careful consideration. His remorse seemed genuine, his horror at his own actions appeared real, but trust once broken isn't easily repaired through words alone. David, I said, my voice softer than it had been for his siblings. Your inheritance remains intact, but with conditions that honor your mother's sacrifice. You'll receive the musical instruments you once calculated for sale value, along with the funds to establish a music scholarship in Elena's name. Your wealth will be tied to nurturing the musical dreams of children whose parents might sacrifice as much as your mother did for you. The scholarship would serve as a permanent reminder of Elena's sold engagement ring and the cost of his musical education. The second symbolic act took place at Elena's grave, where I'd asked all 3 children to meet me the following Saturday. I'd brought 3 items: Elena's replacement wedding ring, a photo from David's first violin recital, and the deed to the house where we'd raised them, standing beside the headstone that marked my beloved wife's resting place. I spoke directly to her memory while my children listened. Elena, our children forgot the sacrifices we made for them. They forgot the love that built the wealth they were so eager to claim. They forgot that family means more than financial inheritance. Then I turned to address them directly. Your mother and I didn't work multiple jobs and sacrifice our own dreams so you could treat our deaths as lottery winnings. We did it because we believed in raising children who would understand the difference between love and money. The final symbolic act was the most powerful. I handed each of them a small wooden box I'd crafted in my workshop, the same space Marcus had dismissed as just another asset to be liquidated. Inside each box is something your mother made for you when you were children, I explained. She spent months on these projects while working her second job to pay for your activities. These boxes also contain copies of every sacrifice she and I made for you, documented and dated. When you're tempted to forget the cost of the life you've built, open these boxes and remember what real love looks like. Sarah opened hers first, finding the tiny knitted sweater Elena had made for her first doll. along with a detailed list of every extra shift Elena had worked to pay for Sarah's college applications. As my children stood there holding physical reminders of the love they'd dismissed as manipulation, I felt the symbolic weight of closure settling over all of us. This wasn't just about money or inheritance. It was about whether they could remember who they used to be before greed had replaced gratitude in their hearts. 3 weeks after the symbolic closure at Elena's grave, it became clear that my children's responses to their reckoning would follow the same patterns their characters had revealed throughout this ordeal. Some would learn and grow, others would remain trapped in their own justifications, but my dignity and position in the community would be restored regardless of their choices. The community's recognition of what I'd endured and exposed came in waves, each more meaningful than any apology my children might have offered. Murphy's Diner, the unofficial town hall where reputations were made and unmade over coffee and gossip, had become a place where my name was spoken with a mixture of admiration and sympathy that I'd never experienced while alive in their minds. "Bob Hayes pulled off the greatest teaching moment I've ever witnessed," declared Frank Morrison, Pete's cousin and the town's retired school principal. "Those kids learned more about consequences in 2 weeks than most people learn in a lifetime." The validation came from unexpected sources. Mrs. Peterson, whose kindness I'd remembered during all those years of shoveling her driveway, organized what she called a proper welcome back to the living at the community center. Nearly 200 people showed up, many of them bringing stories about small kindnesses I'd forgotten but they'd remembered through the years. Tom Bradley from the hardware store stood up during the informal testimonials and shared something that brought tears to my eyes. "Bob Hayes taught my son Jake how to use a circular saw safely when the boy was helping me at the store. Spent 2 hours on a Saturday morning, wouldn't take a dime for his time, said he just wanted to make sure the next generation knew how to work with their hands properly." I barely remembered that Saturday morning, but Jake Bradley, now a successful contractor in the next county, had driven over to thank me personally. "Mr. Hayes, what you taught me that day changed my life. I've built my whole career on the foundation of craftsmanship you showed me when I was 16. These stories kept coming, a testament to a life lived with quiet decency that had made more impact than I'd ever realized. The recognition wasn't just about my recent ordeal with my children. It was about 40 years of being the kind of neighbor and community member who made a town worth living in. The formal recognition came from an unexpected source. Mayor Patricia Collins, who'd known me since our children went to school together, declared the following Saturday Robert Hayes Day, and presented me with a key to the city during a small ceremony at the town square. "Robert Hayes has shown us the difference between being dead to the world and being dead to the people who should matter most," she said in her presentation. "His children may have forgotten his worth, but this community never will." The key was symbolic, of course, but the gesture represented something profound. I'd been given official recognition for my character and contributions while my children were still struggling to understand what they'd lost through their greed. My children's varying responses to this community recognition revealed everything about where they stood in their own journeys toward understanding. Sarah attended the ceremony but stood in the back, her discomfort obvious as she heard story after story about her father's kindness and community contribution. She left before the presentation ended, apparently unable to reconcile the man being honored with the burden she'd convinced herself he'd become. Marcus came to the ceremony but brought Jennifer and their children, using the event as an opportunity to try rehabilitating his own reputation. He made a point of shaking hands with community leaders and expressing pride in his father, though his praise felt calculated rather than genuine. The damage to his construction business was real, and he seemed to view my recognition as a potential pathway back to community acceptance. But it was David's response that touched me most deeply. He didn't attend the ceremony at all, not out of embarrassment or calculation, but because he was spending that Saturday afternoon at Elena's grave with his children, teaching them about their grandmother's sacrifices and their grandfather's love. Rebecca later told me that David had started a tradition of weekly visits to the cemetery, using those moments to help his children understand the difference between having wealth and being worthy of it. The most meaningful recognition came from my grandchildren, who had processed their parents' actions with the clarity that only children possess. 8-year-old Emma drew me a picture showing our family, but in her drawing the adults were small figures while the children and I were drawn large and colorful. When I asked her about the size differences, she explained simply, "The grown-ups forgot how to be big on the inside, but you and us kids remember." That child's wisdom cut through all the complexity of forgiveness, apology, and recognition. She understood that some people choose to become smaller through their actions, while others maintain their true size regardless of how they're treated. The recognition I'd received from the community, from friends, from neighbors, and most importantly from innocent grandchildren who still believed in goodness, was worth more than any apology my children might have offered. Their apologies, when they came, would need to be for their own healing, not for my validation. I had learned that dignity doesn't depend on others recognizing it. It comes from living according to your values and letting your actions speak louder than words. My children's betrayal had revealed their character, but the community's response had reminded me of mine. 6 months after rising from my own grave, I found myself sitting on my front porch on a crisp October morning, watching my grandson Jake help me repair the wooden fence that separated my yard from Mrs. Peterson's. The boy worked with the same careful attention I'd once taught his father, but with an enthusiasm David had lost somewhere along the way to adulthood. This moment represented everything about the new path I'd chosen and the legacy I was determined to build. The Elena Hayes Memorial Music Scholarship had been established with the funds from David's inheritance, and we'd already awarded our first recipient, a 10-year-old girl whose single mother worked 3 jobs to pay for violin lessons. When I handed little Maria Santos that first check, I saw Elena's spirit in the girl's tearful gratitude and her mother's proud determination. This was what real wealth looked like, not numbers in a bank account, but opportunities created for people who understood the value of sacrifice. My relationship with each of my children had evolved along different paths, each reflecting their response to the reckoning they'd experienced. Sarah remained the most distant, visiting only on holidays and maintaining the polite but strained interaction of someone who knew she'd lost something irreplaceable but couldn't quite acknowledge what or why. Her pride prevented genuine reconciliation, but her children spent every other weekend with me, learning from their grandfather the lessons their mother had forgotten. Marcus had surprised me by becoming the most actively repentant of the 3. He'd spent 4 months personally tracking down and repurchasing every tool and piece of equipment he'd sold, often paying 3 times what he'd originally received. More importantly, he'd started bringing his own children to my workshop every Saturday, teaching them the same skills I'd taught him decades earlier. His business was slowly recovering, built now on the reputation for honesty and craftsmanship rather than quick profits, but it was David's transformation that gave me the most hope for the future. He'd taken a leave of absence from his music career to spend time understanding what he'd almost lost. Every Sunday he brought his family for dinner. But these weren't the obligatory visits of the past. These were genuine family gatherings where stories were shared, memories were honored, and the children learned about their grandmother's sacrifices and their grandfather's love. The new path I'd chosen wasn't about punishing my children or proving my worth to a community that already recognized it. It was about building something meaningful from the ashes of betrayal and disappointment. I'd started volunteering at the community center, teaching woodworking to teenagers whose parents couldn't afford expensive hobby classes. These kids reminded me why I'd worked so hard for my own children, why sacrifice for the next generation was never really sacrifice at all when done with love. Pete and I had started a new tradition, monthly dinners for the town's widowers and widows, bringing together people who understood the loneliness of losing a life partner. These gatherings at the community center had become the highlight of many people's social calendars, creating friendships and support networks that enriched lives in ways money never could. The most unexpected gift of my new path came from Rebecca, who had become like a daughter to me in ways my actual daughter never managed. She'd started bringing her children for grandpa lessons twice a week, sessions where I taught them practical skills, family history, and the values their parents sometimes forgot to emphasize. These children would grow up knowing the difference between having things and being grateful for them. My house, once threatened with quick sale to maximize profit, had become the heart of a renewed family circle. The kitchen where Elena had prepared thousands of meals now hosted Sunday dinners with grandchildren who actually wanted to be there. The workshop where Marcus had seen only liquidation value had become a classroom where young hands learned to create rather than just consume. The most profound change was internal. For years after Elena's death, I'd felt like I was merely existing, going through motions while waiting for my children to remember they had a father who loved them. Now I woke up each morning with purpose, knowing that my days were filled with people who valued my presence for reasons that had nothing to do with what I might leave them in my will. As Jake handed me another fence board, his small hands already showing calluses from honest work, I thought about the legacy I was truly building, not the financial inheritance my children had been so eager to claim, but the legacy of character, kindness, and community contribution that would outlast any bank account. "Grandpa," Jake said, pausing in his work to look at me seriously, "my dad says you taught him everything he knows about building things. Will you teach me everything too?" I looked at this earnest 7-year-old, so eager to learn, so grateful for attention, and I saw the future I was choosing to create. Not the future my children had planned while celebrating my death, but the future built on love, respect, and the understanding that real wealth comes from the relationships we nurture and the wisdom we pass on. "I'll teach you everything I can, Jake," I promised, and I meant it. This was my new path, Not the bitter old man my children had imagined I'd become, but the grandfather, mentor, and community member I'd chosen to be. Death, even a fake one, had taught me that the only legacy worth leaving is the one built on love rather than money, on character rather than possessions, and on the hope that someone somewhere will remember not what you owned but who you were.